Week's big political events with Newscast.
Hello. Turns out there is such a thing as too much news. Chris Mason is having a well-deserved night off from Newscast after covering many party conferences, with a few more still to go. But don't worry, plenty of people will be coming into the Newscast studio to keep me company during this episode.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio. Now, normally at this point on a Thursday night, we'd be getting stuck into the week's politics, but we're going to start off this episode of Newscast by talking about the situation in Israel and the military action against Gaza following the Hamas attacks over the weekend. And more specifically, we're actually going to look at how all of this is affecting Jewish people who live here in the UK. Now, I read a book about what antisemitism means in Britain right now last year, and it was written by the author David Baddiel, who many of you will know as a comedian and sometimes singer, and he's done lots of other things as well. And his book is called Jews Don't Count, and he's written another book about atheism since. And he's been on Newscast before, but we asked him if he would come and speak to us again about this, and he said yes. David, thank you for joining us on Newscast.
My pleasure.
I don't want to ask a sort of lame question like what's it been like for the last few days, but can you just give me an insight into some of the things that you've experienced, whether it's how you feel or how people have treated you?
So one of the things that's been interesting for me and complicated for me is that people who might have read Jews Don't Count, my book, or seen my documentary about it, will know that my basic position on Israel is one of refusing to always be dragged into a conversation about Israel when one is trying to talk about anti-Semitism, because there tends to be a thing very prominent in sort of progressive circles, which is to imagine, and this is in itself is a reduction of Jewish experience, that Jewish identity is always deeply connected to Israel, and that indeed, if you try and say something, as I often do, about anti-Semitism, people will instantly say as a reflex, what about Israel? What about Palestine? We have to know what you think about that before we're able to talk about that. And I refute that, because I think, no, I'm trying to talk about something that is centuries old, from well before the establishment of the State of Israel, that is about life for Jews in Britain or America or wherever, and that does not always contingent, as you seem to expect it is, on what's happening in the Middle East. And the truth is as well that I am not someone who, again, is imagined, and there are many Jews like this, who are stereotypically kind of incredibly emotionally connected to Israel. However, I felt that position, although I don't disregard it, that's not like I don't think that anymore, but I definitely felt that it kind of became a bit of an intellectual abstraction this week, that I couldn't put my hand on my heart and say, oh no, Israel's nothing to do with me. For two reasons, I think. One is just the extremity of the horror. The horrors were so extreme, and the reports coming out were so extreme, and the awfulness of it, and the sadness of it, and the vulnerability of people in the face of it was so extreme, that it just overrode my heart on that subject. And the other thing is, and this goes with everything I've always talked about, is I am talking about the condition of being Jewish in general, the way that Jews are stereotyped, the way that Jews are stereotyped as powerful and as oppressive and always in control, and therefore they can never be seen as being vulnerable, even outside of Israel. And I think the thing that slightly broke me was reading about a Jewish school in London, where as a result of what's happening in Israel, the head teacher had started to put out an email saying, Jewish kids don't have to wear the blazer. We normally insist they do wear the blazer, but they don't have to wear the blazer because the blazer has a Star of David on it. I went to a primary school that had a Star of David on it. I remember the National Front standing outside my school and throwing stones at us because we had a Star of David on it, but we still wore the Star of David. And so the deep truth, which is often ignored, sorry, I know this is a very long answer, of what it means to be a Jew, and the sort of race memory, which I have because my mother was born in Nazi Germany, but all Jews have, of threat, of dread, of feeling that the world in general does not care because it imagines you as always powerful and never in a position of vulnerability, was so enhanced, not in a good way, enhanced by what was happening this week, that I just felt I just felt I had to start talking about Israel
Yeah.
in a way that I don't normally.
Oh,
So I have been
this-
doing that on social media.
Yeah, and how has that felt? Because I imagine that the anti-Semitic abuse you were getting on social media anyway was then loads more. I mean, well, the Community Safety Trust who look after synagogues say anti-Semitic abuse has increased 400%. So I imagine
Yeah, well, I
you've
actually
seen...
spoke to Dave Rich today, who's head of the Community Security Trust. As you say, they provide security. It's one of the things I talked about in my documentary. Is I went to my school, my primary school, and I demonstrated the panic stations, what they have to do, what they have to teach 7-year-olds to do in the case of an intruder, which kids don't have to do at most schools. They don't have, like, if a gunman might come to your school, regulations, things you have
Oh,
to
so
learn.
like kids in America do all the
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Right.
In my documentary, it actually went out, my documentary, just after there'd been some terrible outrage in America, and I remember seeing lots and lots of footage of kids learning security regulations, panic room regulations, if an intruder gets in America, and then reading, thank God we don't have to do this in Britain. Lots of people saying that. All Jewish schools do that. All Jewish schools do it. And I remember seeing it happen at my school as an adult, and it broke my heart again, these 7-year-olds having to do that. And can I just tell you something which is incredibly sad, which is when I was filming, we weren't actually allowed to film them actually doing what they do, but I was just filming at the school and talking to the kids. And a kid said to me, why are you talking about, what is this? And I said, well, it's about anti-Semitism, whatever. And he just said, but doesn't every school have to do this? And I couldn't tell him, no, it's just Jewish schools. I couldn't tell him because it's just too sad. So anyway, well, I've been, stuff on social media is just terrible anyway. What I have seen straight away is people leaping on me, conflating Jews and Israel, because that's something which they do and which I've been very careful intellectually not to do. That that the collective responsibility that is imposed upon Jews for Israel in general is something that is part of anti-Semitism, right? But I have conflated them partly because a lot of how you experience anti-Semitism has to be taken into account with what the anti-Semites think. Like, this is true for any minority. This idea that you should not listen to what the people who hate you think. No, you have to listen to them, not because you think it's right, but because you have to protect yourself, right? And what the anti-Semites think is, yes, Jews are all responsible. And I'll tell you one anti-Semites who definitely think that: Hamas. It is in Hamas's charter that all Jews are evil. I believe there is a fatwa being called sort of at the moment by the head of Hamas, in which he calls for Jews, for Arabs all around the region, for Muslims all around the region to come and help, but also for all Jews to be targeted. And so it then becomes impossible for me to continually try and say, no, you have to separate Jews and Israel, because the people who wish to kill Jews are not doing that.
Just on the point about schools, we've just heard that there are a couple of schools that say they're not going to open on Friday.
Okay.
So that's your example about the Blazers, but kind of up a few notches, isn't it?
Well, so the guy from I can't now remember if I've said this already, but what Dave Rich said, he said to me, what you said to me, right? He said to me, how's it been for you? And I was telling him how it's been for me. And I said, what about you? You run the CST. And I said, what have you actually been getting? Because I get this thing where, having been putting myself in the position of being a sort of spokesperson for the Jewish community, I feel a bit weak at the moment, because I'm getting a lot of Jewish people writing to me online and saying, we need your voice, whatever. And so this is partly why I'm doing this interview. But it's a rapidly changing situation. It's one in which, as you know, I'm not entirely in my comfort zone as I am with what you might call the psychology of anti-Semitism. And but I feel I need to say something. So I said, well, that's what it's been like for me. What about you? And he said, it's mainly been parents, Jewish parents, saying to me, is it safe to take my kids to school? And I felt, again, this sort of like deep, deep sadness and dread of that. Because just the ordinary life, right? The ordinary life of people, of British Jews, to feel that sense of terrible anxiety start to creep into that, which has got very, very, profound historical roots for Jews. It's incredibly sad.
You talked about how you've not done many interviews around this. What do you think? What good do you hope comes out of chatting here tonight?
I don't know. I think Jews feel...
It's a very philosophical question.
Jews feel less alone. I know that for the Jews who are writing to me a lot on social media, that I and maybe not bad at articulating how Jews feel. And so they might feel less alone, and I guess they might feel. So I'll give you an example. Okay, this is not an example particularly from now, but it's a more general example. I went on a program to talk about Whoopi Goldberg, talking about how the Holocaust was not about race when she said that. And I said something on that, which for me is in the nursery slopes of my attitude towards anti-Semitism. And that is to say, anti-Semitism, it's racism. And it's not religious intolerance. But a lot of people think it is. A lot of people think, well, it's a religion, so it's religious intolerance. Unfortunately, religious intolerance is not thought of as bad as racism in the way people about things. But the way I can prove to you that anti-Semitism is racism is I am an atheist, but the Gestapo would kill me tomorrow, right? And my great-uncle Arno, who died in the Warsaw Ghetto, was not an observant Jew. And I promise you that white supremacists marching presently in Charlottesville, holding torches or whatever they do, they would not ask me if I kept kosher before they set light to my house. And the reason that I'm saying that helps is I think there are people out there, non-Jews, who think, oh, I get it now. I get why Jews are frightened now. Maybe. I mean, that's, I think, the value of deconstructing the anti-Semitic mindset is actually there are people maybe listening to this who will think, oh, I kind of thought that, but I'm not an anti-Semite, and then maybe they rethink that mindset.
I mean, David, you said a lot of things there, and it was slightly like reading your book. What's just like sort of the simple message you want people to take away from what you've just said there?
I think the simple message I would say is that why it's necessary, even for Jews like me who don't feel immensely connected emotionally and spiritually or even politically with Israel, to talk about Israel is at the moment what's happening in Israel isn't just about Israel. What's happening in Israel is spilling over to affect Jews everywhere. No matter how disconnected you might feel, to how much you might feel, no, I'm a British Jew, I'm an American Jew, and that is who you are feeling, I know all Jews are feeling, oh, I feel a dread, I feel uncertainty, I feel not as safe as I should be feeling, and that is because of what's happening in Israel, which forces us to talk about Israel.
Which also opens you up to lots of questions that the old you didn't want to get into.
No, I don't want to get into it, but I think there is no choice at present. If one is talking about what it means to be a Jew and the safety of Jews and the security of Jews and how you combat anti-Semitism, at the moment, Israel is spilling over in a way that means it is impossible to ignore that situation.
Well, David, thanks very much for chatting to us on Newscast.
Thank you.
Now, this story has dominated episode 2 of a new podcast from the makers and, in fact, the presenters of the Today programme, which has been waking us up on Radio 4 every morning for decades. They are now going into our ears as a podcast because, yes, there is a Today programme podcast available now on BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts. And here to tell us about it are the hosts. Well, Nick is here in the Newscast studio. Hello.
Hi.
And Amal is in the other Newscast studio. Hello.
Your empire is growing. You've got more than one studio. Now you know where the money in the BBC really goes. It's to Newscast Studios.
If anyone walked into the studios, they'd quickly realise that is not where the money has gone. Nick, the Today programme has been covering the Israel-Gaza story brilliantly as it has done over the decades. How do you cover that story differently on the Today programme podcast as opposed to the Today programme?
Well, the idea of the Today podcast is to kind of step back, is take a breath, to kick off your shoes, to ponder where we are, which a live news programme every day is not doing. What we're doing then is trying to get at the immediate, what's just happened now. So it gives us a chance to ask the big question, Israel and Gaza, what next, is the question we're asking on the Today podcast, and to do it with a guy who would know the possible what nexts that there are. And that's Sir Alex Younger, former head of MI6, C, as they're known in the jargon. Uses green ink, as you probably know, Adam, if you get that
and drinks
job.
peppermint tea.
No, but you're only allowed to use green ink if you are C.
Okay.
Every C, that's it's called M in the Bond films, the real name is C, gets a green ink pen so that when you get notes on your letters, you know it is. And he is reflecting on his knowledge and experience of how to combat terrorism of the Middle East and what it will do, and issued I think, quite an interesting warning to Israel that while they had every right to defend themselves, every right internationally, and he defended that right, they should be wary of not doing what Hamas would want them to do, which is to produce chaos, anger and rage in another generation of terrorists.
And let's have a little listen to Sir Alex Younger on the Today podcast.
It's really obvious now that Hamas are essentially laying a trap for Israel and will be well pleased if Israel commits itself to an open-ended, full-scale ground invasion of Gaza because of the scale and intensity of conflict that would entail and the loss of innocent life that would inevitably follow and the radicalization that would engender.
Now, Amol, when I was listening to it on my lunchtime stroll to get my sandwich, I was intrigued to hear you and Nick disagreeing about things. So things like, okay, is it appropriate to say this was Israel's 9/11?
We did disagree on things, and I think that's one of the things that I hope that we can do on the Today podcast, which is maybe a little different to some other podcasts that have got a couple of presenters, which is that there are lots of things on which Nick and I disagree. I mean, fewer things than those on which we agree, but we're different journalists with different brains, and you'd expect us to have constructive and civilized disagreements, which is what podcasts can do. And I do think that the comparisons with 9/11 have a potential, because lots of people all around the world, UK media, US media, Middle Eastern media, have said this is Israel's 9/11. And I get why. And Nick made a couple of very strong points on that, which is that sense of shock, that everything has changed, that they're no longer safe in Israel, which is what Americans felt after 9/11. And also the fact that there is this astonishing failure of intelligence. I mean, the Israeli intelligence services are meant to be some of the best in the world, and how on earth Hamas were able to defeat them like this is maybe worthy of comparison to 9/11. I just feel, I don't want to overstate the disagreement, but I just feel that, of course, we as journalists, like all human beings, understand events through reference to previous events. We have these grooves in our mind which help us make sense of things in front of us. I just think that this is so different to 9/11.
It's a tired cliche.
It's a tired cliche.
He thinks it's a terrible piece of journalism. It's the sort of lazy thinking.
Well, what are we there to do as journalists other than to fight cliche and lazy thinking? And I just think this is a different set of a different bunch of attackers against a different bunch of victims in a different part of the world a couple of decades on. And I just think that we know so much more about 9/11 because we've had a couple of decades to understand it. And I'm just wary. I mean, it's not a big. We didn't have a bust up about it, though. We can say that for later weeks. But I'm wary of reductive cliches.
The difference, I think, with the Today podcast from this one is there's two of us, right? But the difference with those other famous ones made by other organisations is they want to tell you their opinions. I don't want to tell you my opinions. I do want to give you my judgment, my experience, my knowledge. I want to ask, I hope, some intelligence questions. And if you like, people have said, haven't they, they're about centrist dads. That's the audience for the rest of politics and news agents. We're journalist dads. That's what we're doing. We happen to be dads, as it happened, and we're just trying to get to grips with things. So there's no arguments about who's right and who's wrong in terms of opinion, but we'll sometimes ask and see the world in a slightly different way.
And because you're the podcasting newbies, at least in this format, and I'm the veteran, I can say, thanks, boys, and good luck.
Cheers, Adam.
Thank you.
Well, the next person keeping me company in the Newscast studio is Labour's fairly recently appointed National Campaign Coordinator. It's the MP, Pat McFadden. Hello.
Good evening.
I mean this in the nicest way. You've been to a lot of Labour Party conferences in the past because you used to work for Tony Blair before you were elected.
Yeah.
Where does this one we just had rank on the scale of great Labour Party conferences?
Pretty highly. Obviously, it was very overshadowed by events in the Middle East. But it's, as a conference, it ranks pretty highly because I think, obviously, we came off the back of the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election, which was a great result for us, so everybody arrived in good spirits. But I think as well, the combination of good substantial policy announcements and a really great leader speech showed a party in good fettle, quite confident in our ideas, but also conscious of the scale of the task in front of us.
As the person who's one of the masterminds of the upcoming election campaign, did you have to tell people to maybe cool the confidence a little bit? Because you can be seen to be overconfident. Just ask Neil Kinnock.
Confidence in our ideas, and I use the phrase very deliberately. I always tell people to to be aware of the size of the task. I think that's
because it is huge, actually.
Because it is huge. The numbers are big. The result in 2019 was an awful election result. We're very aware of the size of the task, and I almost think there's something complacent about the phrase "no complacency," because your hunger should be deeper than just no complacency. You should be really aware all the time of the need to win the trust of people who have not been habitually voting for your party in recent years and sometimes for a very long time.
So before the conference got underway, on social media on Saturday, there was circulating a very convincing audio deepfake of Keir Starmer, where it sounded like him, like swearing quite seriously at his team. It was very quickly debunked. But do you know where it came from? Are you looking into it?
I have no idea where it came from, but I did listen to it, and it sounded quite realistic.
Did you think when you first heard it, maybe this is real?
Well, by the time I'd listened to it, people had already said this is a deep fake and it's not, don't pay any attention to it. But it was on social media. I did listen to it. It sounded realistic, and it's a real warning of these days what is true, what is not, what are you seeing, where does it come from? And I think that's an issue for everybody. How can you trust the information that you're getting? And that's more of a question now than it was in the past, certainly, with the ability to produce things like that.
Have you thought about how you're going to deal with it? Because if there was one before Labour Party conference, you can guarantee there'll be more than one when we're in the heat of an election campaign.
It's very difficult to deal with. I think you just have to make sure you're putting your own stuff out, telling people to be wary, because people can produce these things and they can be very realistic. So you're relying on people using trusted news sources, perhaps I should say like this one, and exercising a degree of skepticism perhaps about some of the stuff that they see from some places.
Because I'll be honest, the first I heard of it was the debunking, which was done by a lot of Tory MPs, actually. A lot of Tory MPs were saying you shouldn't listen to it. And the first thing I did was go and listen to it. So actually, the debunking pointed me towards the offending item.
I did think that as I was listening to it.
Actually, maybe...
Am I sort of falling for this? Would I have ever found this if so many people hadn't been saying this is a fake, you shouldn't, but that's the age we're in, isn't it?
Never mind deepfakes. What about negative campaigning and tweets like the one you put out a few months ago, basically accusing Rishi Sunak of letting child sexual offenders out of jail? On reflection, is that a good way to campaign? Is that a good tweet to post?
It's entirely legitimate for us to point out the lack of prosecution in important areas of the criminal justice system, and that's one of them. And it's true, the prosecution rates have fallen. People are feeling less safe, and we want to do something about that. So it's legitimate to point that out.
So we can expect more tweets of that ilk, or X's as we must call them now, or maybe even old-fashioned billboards.
I remember billboards, and look, I can't predict what we'll do. We will be attacked in the campaign, I'm sure, and we'll have a combination of pointing out the Conservative record, which is legitimate for us to do, and advancing our own policies. And we know we need to do both. And we had some good policy at the conference. We had good policy on 700,000 new dentistry appointments, 2 million more operations and NHS procedures to get waiting lists down, the policies on housing and boosting home ownership, and a good package on crime and antisocial behaviour, which is a real issue for many local neighbourhoods. So you've got to push forward what you're putting out yourself. And of course, we're going to point out the government's record over the last 13 years.
You mentioned the big housing announcement, which is a huge feature of Keir Starmer's speech. And then when he was speaking to Chris Mason the next day, he proudly announced that he was a YIMBY, a yes in my backyard, as opposed to a no in my backyard, a NIMBY. Are you a YIMBY too?
You'll always find, if you dig around, MPs who have objected to certain developments in their own constituency. They might have welcomed 20 others, which often isn't highlighted. but they'll have objected to one or two. So you can
Is
always
anyone coming to mind when you're saying this?
Oh, I'm sure if you look through the records, you'll find a number of MPs who've done that. To be honest, I appreciate people can have fun with that, but I think there's a bigger issue, which is it takes too long to get stuff built in the UK. It's not just about housing; it's about infrastructure, about what we need to do with the national grid, and every major investor we speak to tells us this. And so I think as a country, we've got to do something about this.
As the campaign coordinator, though, you'll know that making a pledge like that will antagonize some people who disagree with you. And if that means that there are some seats that you don't win as a result, is that a price worth paying?
Well, if
you've done the calculations.
If you never want to antagonize anyone, I would advise not going into politics. You have to make big decisions. Of course, there's still a planning process. Of course, you want local consent and local voice in these things. But
I thought you were going to override if local consent is withheld.
You can't escape the basic problem, which is it takes too long to get things built, and we're not building enough homes in this country. And so perhaps in certain places that will happen. But in the end, a government has to make a policy call, and the policy call that Keir Starmer is making is to put his foot on the gas when it comes to new build.
In your office, do you have a massive map of all the constituencies?
No.
Or is it's up here?
I don't have a massive. I'm trying to think of the pictures that are up in my office at the moment. I've got a picture of Wolverhampton Market.
Oh, lovely. Okay. And the reason I ask is because I wonder has the electoral geography of the UK actually changed a lot more than people reckon, with all those people moving to different places after the pandemic, if they could afford to, and like house prices forcing a lot of people. Do you think actually maybe some of us have misjudged like where people are these days?
And look, to go back to the Scottish by-election result in Rutherglen and Hamilton West, of course, that might change the calculation about what seats can be won in different parts of the country. I mean, to be honest, I'm not really attracted to the kind of politics that slices and dices the electorate too much. I believe in a big, open, appealing message, an everywhere message. We have everywhere problems, and I think we need everywhere messages in response to them. And my view is that politicians can sort of kid themselves on that they can build a coalition with a micro policy to appeal to this group over here who are very concerned about that. And if we add that to this group and this group, I don't really think it works like that. Okay. I think people want a bigger national story. Where do you want to lead the country? What do you want to do with it? We talked about housing. There are other challenges too. What are you going to do about the NHS waiting list? What are you going to do about educational opportunity and so on? And my own preference, and I hope this will be reflected in the campaign that we run, is that we propose everywhere answers to everywhere problems.
In 97, New Labour had a computer called Excalibur.
Yeah.
Have you got a version of that now?
Well, I'm going to let you into a little secret. Nobody's watching, are they? I mean,
not by this point.
We did have a very clever computer called Excalibur, but actually much of the attack and rebuttal work that Excalibur was meant to do was really done by the brilliant staff who were working in the attack and rebuttal unit. And I think it was a good example of back then how AI is maybe not as good as the human factor, and I still think the human factor will be the best thing that we have.
Pat McFadden, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thanks to everyone who's kept me company while Chris has been away, and we'll be back with another episode very soon. Bye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
The natural world continues to surprise